In the annals of American military history, few units have achieved the legendary status of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Composed almost entirely of second-generation Japanese Americans, Nisei, this regiment became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the United States Armed Forces. Their story is one of extraordinary courage, unwavering loyalty, and the pursuit of dignity in the face of profound injustice. The 442nd fought not only against the Axis powers in Europe, but also against the prejudice and discrimination that had branded them as enemy aliens in their own country. Their motto, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian gambling term meaning to risk everything, perfectly encapsulated their approach to both combat and their fight for acceptance as true Americans. Historical context. Japanese Americans before World War II. To understand the significance of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one must first grasp the historical context in which these soldiers volunteered to serve. Japanese immigration to the United States began in earnest in the late 19th century, with many settling in Hawaii and along the west coast. These immigrants, known as Issei, first generation, faced significant discrimination from the outset. Laws such as the 1790 Naturalization Act restricted citizenship to free white persons, effectively barring Asian immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. The 1924 Immigration Act further codified this discrimination by prohibiting immigration from Japan entirely. Despite these legal barriers, the Japanese American community thrived. The Nisei, American-born children of Japanese immigrants, were US citizens by birth and grew up navigating two cultures. They attended American schools, spoke English as their primary language, and considered themselves thoroughly American, even as they maintained connections to their ancestral heritage. By 1940, approximately 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry lived in the continental United States, with another 158,000 in Hawaii. Nearly two-thirds were American citizens. The Japanese American community established businesses, farms, and strong social networks. They contributed to their local economies and communities, yet remained subject to persistent prejudice. Anti-Asian sentiment, fueled by economic competition and racial stereotypes, was particularly strong in California and other western states. Various alien land laws prevented Japanese immigrants from owning property, forcing many to lease land or register ownership in their American-born children's names. This atmosphere of discrimination would intensify dramatically following the events of December 7, 1941, Executive Order 9066, and the Internment. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed American society overnight. In the panic and anger that followed, Japanese Americans became targets of suspicion and hostility. Despite the fact that not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during World War II, fear and racism drove policy at the highest levels of government. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Though the order did not explicitly mention Japanese Americans, its implementation targeted them almost exclusively. In the spring and summer of 1942, approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, roughly two-thirds of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes on the west coast and incarcerated in 10 remote internment camps scattered across desolate areas of the American interior. The speed and totality of the removal was shocking. Families were given as little as 48 hours to dispose of their homes, businesses, and possessions before being transported to assembly centres, often converted fairgrounds or racetracks, where they lived in horse stalls while permanent camps were constructed. They were then moved to camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, located in places like Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Minidoka in Idaho, and Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Idaho. Hart Mountain in Wyoming, and Rohwa and Jerome in Arkansas. Life in the camps was harsh. Families lived in cramped barracks with no privacy, sharing communal mess halls and latrines. The camps were located in some of the most inhospitable environments in America: scorching deserts, windswept plains, and mosquito-infested swamps. Despite these conditions, internees worked to create community, establishing schools, newspapers, gardens, and social organisations. Yet the fundamental injustice of their incarceration, the loss of freedom, property, and dignity based solely on their ancestry, was a profound betrayal of American ideals. The decision to serve. Against this backdrop of injustice, the formation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team stands as a remarkable testament to the character and patriotism of Japanese Americans. Initially, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese American soldiers already serving in the US Army were discharged or assigned to non-combat roles. The Selective Service classified Nisei as enemy aliens, despite their citizenship, and refused to draft them. This categorical exclusion was both insulting and demoralizing to young Japanese American men who considered themselves loyal Americans. However, military necessity and the advocacy of certain military leaders began to shift policy. The 100th Infantry Battalion, formed in June 1942 from Hawaiian National Guard units composed of Japanese Americans, was already training on the mainland. Their performance would later prove instrumental in the creation of the 442nd. Additionally, military intelligence recognized the value of Japanese-speaking Americans for translation and intelligence work in the Pacific Theater, leading to the formation of the Military Intelligence Service. In January 1943, the War Department announced it would form a segregated Japanese-American combat unit and accept Nisei volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland internment camps. The decision to recruit from the camps was particularly controversial. The government was asking young men to volunteer for military service while simultaneously imprisoning their families. To add insult to injury, all internees aged 17 and older were required to complete a loyalty questionnaire that included two particularly problematic questions. Question 27 asked if they would be willing to serve in combat, and question 28 asked if they would forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, and swear unqualified allegiance to the United States. For many, these questions were deeply offensive. The phrasing of question 28 implied they held allegiance to the emperor in the first place, and answering yes seemed to confirm that assumption. Answering no to these questions led to one being labelled disloyal and potentially being segregated into the Tule Lake Camp, which became a maximum security facility for those deemed dangerous or disloyal. The loyalty questionnaire created deep divisions within the Japanese American community and families. Despite the painful circumstances, approximately 10,000 men from Hawaii volunteered for service, far exceeding the quota. From the mainland camps, where bitterness over incarceration ran deeper, about 1,200 volunteered initially. Later, when the draft was reinstated for Japanese Americans in January 1944, thousands more were inducted into service. These men enlisted for complex and varied reasons. Some genuinely believed in American ideals despite their betrayal and sought to prove their loyalty. Others hoped that military service would improve conditions for their families in the camps. Some felt pressured by community expectations, while others saw the military as an escape from the camps or an opportunity for adventure. Many believed that only through military service and demonstrated sacrifice could Japanese Americans ever hope to achieve full acceptance in American society. Formation and training. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated on February 1, 1943, at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The unit would eventually consist of over 14,000 men, including the 442nd Infantry Regiment, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, and various support units. The 100th Infantry Battalion, which had been training separately and would later see extensive combat, would eventually be folded into the 442nd as its first battalion, though it retained its original designation in recognition of its distinguished service. Camp Shelby, located in the pine forests of southern Mississippi, provided the setting for the unit's intensive training. For many of the volunteers, particularly those from Hawaii, this was their first experience with the mainland United States and with the intense racism of the Jim Crow South. The Hawaiian volunteers, who had grown up in a more racially diverse and tolerant environment, were shocked by segregation and the treatment of African Americans. Local residents were often hostile or at best confused by these Asian soldiers in American uniforms. The training itself was rigorous and comprehensive. The soldiers underwent basic infantry training, weapons proficiency, squad and platoon tactics, and various specialised skills. Despite the prejudice they faced, most of the white officers who trained them came to respect the Nisei soldiers' dedication and ability. The unit developed a strong esprit de corps, though tensions sometimes arose between the mainland volunteers, known as Kotonks, and the Hawaiian volunteers, known as Buddha heads. These nicknames originated from the sounds their bodies supposedly made when hitting the ground, Kotonk for the mainlanders on frozen ground, and the Hawaiian pidgin word for a type of package or bundle. Cultural differences and different experiences with discrimination created friction, but shared purpose and the crucible of combat would forge these groups into a unified fighting force. Physical training was demanding, preparing the soldiers for the rigours of infantry combat. They learned to work as coordinated units, mastering tactics for assault, defence and manoeuvre. The artillery battalion trained on the 105mm howitzer, becoming proficient in supporting infantry operations. Throughout their training, the men of the 442nd were aware that they carried a special burden. They would be scrutinised more intensely than other units, and their performance would reflect on their entire community. This awareness drove many to push themselves even harder. Combat in Italy. Proving ground. In May 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team shipped out to Europe, arriving in Italy in late May. Meanwhile, the 100th Infantry Battalion had already been in combat since September 1943, fighting its way up the Italian peninsula through some of the war's most brutal fighting. The 100th had participated in the Allied landings at Salerno, fought through the mountains at Cassino, and participated in the breakout from Anzio. By the time the 442nd arrived, the 100th had already earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion due to its heavy casualties. The unit had suffered hundreds of casualties by April 1944, nearly replacing its original complement. The 442nd joined the 100th Battalion and entered combat on June 26, 1944, at Belvedere. Their baptism of fire came quickly as they pushed inland, encountering German defensive positions in the rough terrain. Italy presented a particularly challenging combat environment. The mountainous landscape favoured defence, with German forces occupying fortified positions on high ground. Towns were often perched on hilltops, requiring attackers to advance across open ground under enemy fire. The Gothic Line, a formidable series of German defensive fortifications running across the Italian peninsula, would prove one of the war's toughest obstacles. The 442nd's first major engagement came in late June as part of the offensive to capture the city of Livorno, Leghorn. The unit advanced through heavily defended positions, taking casualties, but proving their combat effectiveness. On July 15th, the 100th Infantry Battalion officially became part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, though it retained its numerical designation, becoming the 100th Battalion, 442nd Infantry Regiment, in honour of its distinguished combat record. Throughout July and August 1944, the 442nd participated in the drive up the Arno River Valley, engaging in intense firefights and advancing against determined German resistance. The fighting was often brutal and intimate, with small unit actions in difficult terrain. The Nisei soldiers demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical skill, earning the respect of Allied forces and enemy combatants alike. German prisoners reportedly expressed surprise that their captors were Asian Americans, having believed Nazi propaganda about American racial weakness. One of the 442nd's most significant Italian campaigns was the assault on the Gothic Line in the autumn of 1944. The unit was assigned to capture several key hills and towns in the mountainous terrain northeast of Pisa. Between September and October, the 442nd fought through some of the most difficult terrain and weather conditions imaginable. Cold rain, mud, and steep mountains made movement difficult, while German defenders had months to prepare fortified positions. During this period, the 442nd captured numerous objectives including Hills 140, 600 and 610, and the towns of Belvedere. The fighting was characterised by squad and platoon-level actions, with small groups of soldiers working their way up slopes under fire, clearing German positions with grenades and small arms. Casualties mounted steadily. The combat was exhausting, with soldiers spending weeks in the line without relief, sleeping in muddy foxholes, and enduring constant exposure to enemy fire and harsh weather. The tactics employed by the 442nd combined standard infantry doctrine with innovative approaches. The soldiers became skilled at night operations, infiltration, and coordinated attacks using terrain to mask their movements. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion provided crucial support, delivering accurate fire that suppressed enemy positions and enabled infantry advances. Unit cohesion remained strong despite heavy losses, with soldiers motivated by loyalty to their comrades and determination to prove their worth. The rescue of the lost battalion. The 442nd's most famous action came in the Vosges Mountains of France in October 1944, in an operation that would become legendary, the rescue of the lost battalion. After the breakout from Italy, the 442nd was transferred to France to participate in the Allied advance through the Vosges, a heavily forested mountain range in northeastern France near the German border. On October 24, 1944, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, primarily composed of soldiers from Texas, became surrounded by German forces near the town of Bifontaine. The battalion, numbering about 275 men, was cut off deep in the forest with no clear route of retreat. German forces had encircled the position and were systematically attacking, attempting to destroy or capture the isolated American unit. The surrounded battalion was running low on supplies, and casualties were mounting. Multiple attempts to break through to the trapped battalion had failed with heavy casualties. The terrain, steep, forested mountains, favoured the defenders, and German forces were well positioned to block relief attempts. On October 26th, the 442nd was ordered to rescue the surrounded battalion. The unit was already depleted from previous combat, with many companies well below normal strength, but they accepted the mission without hesitation. The rescue operation began on October 27th, with the 442nd advancing through dense forest against entrenched German positions. The Germans had established multiple defensive lines, using the terrain expertly to slow the American advance. Machine gun nests covered the approaches, and mortar fire rained down on the attacking soldiers. The Nisei soldiers faced withering fire as they pushed through the woods, fighting from tree to tree, often unable to see more than a few yards ahead. The combat was intense and personal. Soldiers engaged German positions at close range using grenades, bayonets and small arms. Each defensive line had to be overcome through direct assault, with soldiers crawling through underbrush and scrambling up slopes under fire. Casualties were heavy from the outset. Companies that started the battle with 100 to 125 men were quickly reduced to half strength or less. Still, the 442nd pressed forward, gaining ground metre by metre. For 5 days and nights, the 442nd fought continuously through the forest. Soldiers went without sleep, fighting in cold rain and mud. Resupply was difficult, with ammunition and medical supplies having to be carried forward through contested terrain. The wounded often had to wait hours for evacuation. Despite exhaustion and mounting casualties, the unit maintained its offensive momentum. On October 30th, after 6 days of brutal combat, elements of the 442nd broke through the German lines and reached the lost battalion. The rescue succeeded, but at an enormous cost. Of the approximately 211 men rescued, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, including more than 200 killed. Some companies were reduced to fewer than 20 men. K Company, which started the battle with 186 men, finished with only 17 able to walk off the battlefield. The rescue of the lost battalion earned the 442nd widespread recognition and numerous decorations. The operation demonstrated the unit's extraordinary fighting spirit and willingness to sacrifice. However, it also highlighted the terrible cost of proving loyalty through blood. Some soldiers later expressed bitterness about being thrown into such a desperate situation while their families remained imprisoned in camps. Yet their success was undeniable. They had accomplished what other units could not, cementing their reputation as elite troops. Further combat and the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. Following the Vosges campaign, the severely depleted 442nd was withdrawn from the line for rest and refitting. Replacements arrived, including many who had been drafted from the internment camps. The unit spent the winter of 1944 to 45 reorganising and training, though some elements remained in combat. In March 1945, the 442nd returned to Italy for the final offensive against German forces. The spring 1945 campaign in Italy saw the 442nd participating in the breakthrough of the German Gothic Line and the Po Valley offensive. The fighting remained difficult, but German resistance was crumbling as the war neared its end. The 442nd continued to distinguish itself in combat, participating in the capture of numerous towns and German positions. By the end of April, German forces in Italy were in full retreat, and the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. While the infantry battalions fought in Italy and France, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion had a unique experience. In March 1945, the battalion was detached from the 442nd and assigned to support the 7th Army's advance into Germany. As American forces pushed into southern Germany, the 522nd provided artillery support for various units, participating in the final campaigns of the European War. In late April 1945, elements of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion became among the first Allied troops to liberate prisoners from subcamps of the Dachau concentration camp complex. As the battalion advanced through Bavaria, soldiers encountered survivors from Kaufering and other subcamps, discovering hundreds of emaciated prisoners, many near death. The Japanese-American artillerymen, whose families were imprisoned in American camps, now found themselves liberating victims of Nazi concentration camps, a profound and tragic irony not lost on the soldiers. The 522nd soldiers shared their rations with the survivors and provided what aid they could before other units arrived to establish proper care. This experience deeply affected many of the soldiers, who saw firsthand the ultimate consequences of racism and ethnic persecution. The encounter created a bond between Japanese-American soldiers and Holocaust survivors that would endure for decades. Many soldiers later reflected that liberating concentration camp victims gave deeper meaning to their service and sacrifice. Casualties and Decorations. The combat record of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is extraordinary by any measure. The unit compiled an unprecedented record of awards and decorations, becoming the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. The casualty rate was equally staggering, reflecting the intensity of the combat the unit experienced and the aggressive tactics employed. Over the course of the war, the 442nd suffered approximately 9,486 casualties, including over 600 killed in action. Given that the unit's strength was approximately 14,000 over the course of the war, with about 4,000 serving at any given time, the casualty rate exceeded 200% when accounting for replacements. Some soldiers were wounded multiple times and returned to duty. The Purple Heart Medal, awarded for wounds received in combat, was earned 9,486 times by members of the unit, a stunning figure that speaks to the ferocity of the fighting and the soldiers' determination to continue despite injuries. The unit earned 21 Medals of Honor, though most were upgraded from lesser decorations many decades after the war. In 2000, when a review determined that racial bias had prevented proper recognition. The original Medal of Honor recipient during the war was Private First Class Sadao Munemori, who sacrificed his life to save his squad by smothering a German grenade with his body in Italy on April 5, 1945. The belatedness of recognition for the others represents a final injustice, that even extraordinary heroism was initially insufficient to overcome racial prejudice in official recognition. The 442nd earned 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, second only to the Medal of Honor, 560 Silver Stars, with 28 oak leaf clusters indicating a second award, 22 Legion of Merit medals, 15 Soldiers' Medals, 4,000 Bronze Star medals, and numerous other decorations from the United States and foreign governments. The unit received 7 Presidential Unit citations, an extraordinary number reflecting exceptional performance by entire battalions or companies in specific actions. France awarded the unit the Croix de Guerre and Italy bestowed additional honours. Individual soldiers accumulated impressive records. Daniel Inouye, who would later become a US Senator from Hawaii, lost his right arm in combat in Italy while single-handedly attacking 3 German machine gun positions. He continued fighting even after being hit by a grenade that destroyed his arm, killing 2 more Germans before finally accepting evacuation. Inouye received the Distinguished Service Cross, upgraded to the Medal of Honor in 2000. Many soldiers earned multiple Purple Hearts, Silver Stars and Bronze Stars, returning to combat after each wound. The decorations represent not just individual heroism, but also unit effectiveness. The 442nd successfully completed every mission assigned, often against overwhelming odds. Their tactical proficiency, aggressiveness, and cohesion made them one of the most effective combat units in the European theatre. Senior commanders repeatedly requested the 442nd for difficult missions, knowing the unit could be counted on to succeed where others had failed. The Homefront. Life in the camps continues. While the soldiers of the 442nd fought in Europe, their families remained imprisoned in the internment camps. This created a painful contradiction that weighed heavily on many soldiers. They were risking their lives for a country that continued to imprison their parents, siblings, and loved ones. Letters from home described the harsh conditions, the loss of property and businesses, and the psychological toll of incarceration. Families worried constantly about their sons and brothers in combat while dealing with their own deprivation. The camps themselves evolved throughout the war. Some internees were allowed to leave for work or education in the interior states, though this required extensive loyalty checks and sponsorship. College students could attend universities outside the exclusion zone. Agricultural workers could take seasonal employment. However, the West Coast remained closed to Japanese Americans, and the camps continued to house the majority of the incarcerated population. Within the camps, opinions about military service were divided. Some families were proud of their son's service and saw it as the path to eventual acceptance and justice. Others were deeply bitter, viewing the soldiers as dupes who were dying for a country that had betrayed them. Some families faced ostracism from other internees for having sons in the military. The draft, when reimposed in 1944, created further divisions, with some young men refusing induction as an act of protest against incarceration. These draft resistors were prosecuted and imprisoned, creating yet another painful split in the community. Families of soldiers killed in action received the terrible news in the camps, mourning their losses behind barbed wire. Gold Star mothers, those who had lost sons in combat, occupied a particularly tragic position, having sacrificed the most while remaining imprisoned. The government's recognition of their son's sacrifice seemed hollow against the backdrop of continued incarceration. Some soldiers felt guilty about leaving their families in the camps while they served, wondering if they had made the right choice. Despite these hardships, many families drew strength from their son's service. News of the 442nd's accomplishments reached the camps and provided a source of pride. When the unit received its Presidential Unit citations and decorations, it offered hope that such service might lead to justice and restitution. The soldiers' letters home often minimised the dangers they faced, trying to spare their families additional worry, while their families' letters often understated camp conditions for the same reason: return and recognition. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the 442nd began returning home in the summer and fall of 1945. On July 15, 1946, the unit participated in a triumphant parade in Washington, D.C., where President Harry S. Truman reviewed the troops and awarded the unit its 7th Presidential Unit citation. In his remarks, Truman stated, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won." It was a moment of recognition and validation for all the soldiers had endured and accomplished. However, the soldiers' return home was bittersweet. While they were celebrated as heroes, they came back to find their communities shattered. Properties had been sold or seized. businesses were gone. Years of education and career development had been lost to internment. Anti-Japanese prejudice remained strong in many areas, with veterans sometimes facing discrimination and hostility despite their service. Some returning soldiers found signs in businesses stating "no Japs allowed," or were refused service. The internment camps closed in 1945 to 46, with the last closing in March 1946. Families struggled to rebuild their lives from scratch, often with no resources and no place to return to. Many had lost everything they had built before the war. The government provided minimal assistance, a train ticket, and $25 upon leaving the camps. Rebuilding Japanese American communities would take years and extraordinary effort. Despite these challenges, the veterans of the 442nd played crucial roles in rebuilding Japanese American communities and fighting for civil rights. Their service had demonstrated undeniable loyalty and provided moral authority to challenge discrimination. Veterans used the GI Bill to pursue education and start businesses, though they often faced discrimination in housing and employment. Their success in rebuilding their lives and contributing to American society gradually changed attitudes, though full acceptance would take decades. The 442nd's combat record became a powerful argument against racial discrimination and internment. In the immediate post-war years, as the injustice of the internment became clearer, the soldiers' service stood as evidence that Japanese Americans were loyal Americans who deserved full rights and citizenship. The unit's history was invoked in debates over immigration reform, citizenship for Issei, and redress for internment. Legacy and long-term impact. The legacy of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team extends far beyond its immediate military accomplishments. The unit's service had profound impacts on Japanese American communities, civil rights more broadly, and American military history. For Japanese Americans, the 442nd service became a cornerstone of community identity and pride. The soldiers' sacrifices helped overturn discriminatory laws and policies. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act finally allowed Japanese immigrants to become naturalized citizens, partly due to recognition of Japanese American military service. The 442nd's record was cited in campaigns for redress and reparations for internment, lending moral weight to demands for justice. Many 442nd veterans became community leaders, politicians, business people, and professionals. Senator Daniel Inouye served Hawaii in the US Senate from 1963 until his death in 2012, becoming president pro tempore of the Senate. Senator Spark Matsunaga, also a 442nd veteran, served in the Senate from 1977 to 1990. Numerous veterans served in state legislatures, local government, and civic organizations. Their leadership helped transform Japanese Americans from a marginalized minority to a well-integrated community. The 442nd's example influenced broader civil rights movements. African American leaders cited the unit's service in arguing against segregation in the military, leading to President Truman's 1948 order desegregating the armed forces. The principle that combat service proved citizenship and deserved full equality resonated across civil rights struggles. If Japanese Americans could prove their loyalty despite internment, other minorities argued, then discrimination against any group was unjustifiable. In military terms, the 442nd demonstrated that ethnically homogeneous units could be extraordinarily effective. The unit's cohesion, derived partly from shared cultural background and common purpose, contributed to its success. However, the unit's existence also highlighted the absurdity of segregation. These were American soldiers who happened to be of Japanese ancestry, no different in their capabilities and patriotism from any other Americans. The lesson learned was not that segregated units worked, but that ethnic background was irrelevant to military effectiveness, and that integration was the proper path forward. The story of the 442nd became embedded in American culture through books, films, and documentaries. The 1951 film Go for Broke, starring Van Johnson, introduced the unit's story to a mass audience. Numerous documentaries have chronicled the unit's history. The US Postal Service issued a stamp honouring the 442nd. Museums and memorials preserve the unit's history, including the National Museum of the United States Army and the Japanese American National Museum, the Redress movement, and historical recognition. The legacy of the 442nd became intertwined with the movement for redress and recognition of internment's injustice. For decades after the war, many Japanese Americans were reluctant to discuss the internment, feeling shame over their incarceration and wanting to move forward. The veterans' service was celebrated, but the camps were often mentioned only obliquely, if at all. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new generation of Japanese Americans, inspired by civil rights movements, began demanding acknowledgement of the internment's injustice and redress for its victims. The 442nd's combat record became a powerful rhetorical tool. If the government could imprison the families of soldiers who fought so bravely, then the injustice of internment was undeniable. The soldiers' sacrifice highlighted the absurdity of considering Japanese Americans disloyal or dangerous. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, established in 1980, investigated the internment and concluded it was motivated by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Commission's report, Personal Justice Denied, cited the 442nd Service as evidence of Japanese American loyalty and the wrongness of internment. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologised for the internment and provided compensation to surviving internees. Many 442nd veterans were ambivalent about the redress movement. Some felt their service had already proven their loyalty and that revisiting internment was unnecessary or divisive. Others became active supporters, arguing that recognition of the injustice was essential for national healing and preventing future violations of civil rights. The veterans' voices carried particular weight. Their patriotism was unquestionable, making their criticisms of internment more powerful. In 2000, a review of World War II decorations led to 21 Asian American veterans, mostly from the 442nd and 100th Battalion, receiving upgrades to the Medal of Honor. The review concluded that racial bias had prevented proper recognition during and immediately after the war. President Bill Clinton presented the medals in a White House ceremony, acknowledging that, "Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated." The belated recognition was bittersweet, validation finally received, but decades too late for many recipients who had already died. Reflections on loyalty, identity, and citizenship. The story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team raises profound questions about loyalty, identity, and the meaning of citizenship. What did it mean for these soldiers to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families? How did they reconcile their patriotism with their treatment? And what does their service tell us about American identity and belonging? For the soldiers themselves, motivations were complex and varied. Some enlisted out of genuine patriotism, believing in American ideals despite the gap between ideals and reality. They saw military service as affirming their identity as Americans and proving that ideals of freedom and equality ultimately mattered more than temporary injustice. Others were motivated by family honour, cultural values emphasising duty and obligation or community pressure. Some sought to escape the camps or find adventure. Most combined multiple motivations, a mix of idealism, pragmatism, anger, pride, and hope. Many soldiers later reflected on the contradictions they lived. They had fought for American values, democracy, freedom, equality, while their families were denied those very rights. Some expressed bitterness about this contradiction, feeling they had been used by a government that continued to discriminate against them. Others maintained that their service was necessary precisely because of that injustice, that only through extraordinary sacrifice could they hope to change minds and policies. The concept of proving loyalty through combat service is itself problematic. It suggests that citizenship is conditional, that belonging must be earned through blood. Yet for the 442nd soldiers, this was the reality they faced. In a society that doubted their allegiance, they felt compelled to demonstrate it in the most extreme way possible. Their willingness to do so speaks to their determination to be accepted as Americans, but also to the injustice of requiring such proof. The soldiers' identity was complex. They were American, yet seen as perpetual foreigners. They were citizens, yet imprisoned. They were soldiers fighting for freedom while their families were incarcerated. This liminality, this sense of being between worlds, shaped their experience and legacy. Their service was an assertion of American identity in the face of rejection, a claim to belonging that could not be denied when backed by sacrifice. The 442nd story also illuminates the nature of American identity itself. At its best, American identity is based on shared values and commitment to democratic ideals, not ethnic background or ancestry. The Nisei soldiers embodied this civic nationalism. They were Americans not because of their race, but because of their choices, actions, and values. Their service demonstrated that American identity is something one claims and performs, not something granted based on appearance. Yet the soldier's story also reveals how far reality falls short of this ideal. Racism and xenophobia repeatedly trumped civic nationalism, defining Americanness in racial and ethnic terms. The very existence of the 442nd as a segregated unit reflected this. These soldiers were set apart based on ancestry, not integrated as simply Americans. The internment itself was the ultimate denial of civic nationalism, reducing citizenship to ancestry, the 442nd in contemporary memory. Today, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team occupies an important place in American historical memory, though its story is not as widely known as it should be. For Japanese Americans, the unit remains a source of immense pride and a powerful symbol of their community's patriotism and resilience. Memorials, museums, and community organisations work to preserve the unit's history and honour the veterans. The remaining veterans, now in their late 90s and early hundreds, are treated with reverence in their communities. As this generation passes, there is urgency to record their stories and preserve their legacy. Organisations like the Go for Broke National Education Centre work to collect oral histories, artefacts, and documents related to the 442nd and other Japanese-American military units. The 442nd story has contemporary relevance as debates continue over immigration, national security, and civil liberties. When proposals emerge to register, surveil, or restrict Muslims, Arabs, or other ethnic groups based on national security concerns, civil rights advocates invoke the internment and the 442nd as cautionary tales. The soldier's story demonstrates both the injustice of collective punishment based on ancestry and the wrongness of doubting Americans' loyalty based on their ethnic background. Educational curricula increasingly include the internment and the 442nd, ensuring new generations learn this history. The story offers valuable lessons about prejudice, courage, civil liberties, and citizenship. For students, particularly those from minority backgrounds, the 442nd's example can be empowering, demonstrating how people can resist injustice and prove their worth despite systematic discrimination. The 442nd's motto, Go for Broke, has entered broader American culture as an expression of courage and determination. It represents the willingness to risk everything for a cause, to commit fully despite uncertainty or danger. This spirit of perseverance against odds, of refusing to be defeated by circumstances, resonates beyond the specific historical context. Conclusion. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team represents one of the most remarkable stories in American military history. These soldiers fought with extraordinary courage and effectiveness, becoming the most decorated unit of their size in US history. They did so while carrying the burden of proving their loyalty, while their families were imprisoned, while facing discrimination and doubt. Their service in Italy and France, particularly actions like the rescue of the lost battalion, demonstrated heroism that cannot be questioned. Yet the 442nd story is about more than military prowess. It is a story about identity, belonging, and the meaning of citizenship in a diverse democracy. It illuminates both the best and worst aspects of American society, the courage and idealism that lead people to sacrifice for democratic values, alongside the racism and fear that betray those same values. the soldiers of the 442nd were placed in an impossible position. They were asked to prove loyalty that should never have been questioned, to earn through bloodshed rights that should have been guaranteed by birth. That they succeeded in their military mission is undeniable. Whether they should have been required to undertake such a mission, whether proving loyalty through combat was just or necessary, remains a painful question that haunts their legacy.